Today in Ancient DOS Games, we're taking a look at Arkanoid, one of the most pivotal arcade games of the 80s, as it took the tried and true formula pioneered by Breakout, which was losing ground due to lack of innovation, and added new features, which once again got people interested in it. Actually, Arkanoid was one of the original lawsuits to come about in the dawn of video games, which helped to define what did and did not qualify as theft, as Breakout was owned by Atari, while Taito made Arkanoid. So Atari sued Taito on the grounds that Arkanoid was a blatant ripoff of Breakout. But Taito won on the grounds that similar but not identical game mechanics, combined with original art and sound, made Arkanoid different enough to be its own original property, independent of Breakout. It sort of created a trend where if indie developers were making their own Breakout game but were adding power-ups and enemies or such, they'd often tack the word Noid on their names. Heck, I've already covered a couple such games here on the show, such as Electronoid and Aquanoid, and I'm kind of guilty of doing this myself, as when I originally started my numbering convention for my conceptual screenshots back in 1999, the very first group number 000, was such a game, which I was going to call Gravanoid. And by the way, this idea evolved considerably since I first came up with it 18 years ago, so I might still make it one day, though it won't look anything like this. Anyways, Breakout clones have been on the decline for a while now. Not that they don't still get made, as there's usually at least a couple coming out every year, and sometimes from notable developers, including modernized versions of Arkanoid. But the trouble with Breakout gameplay has always been a double-edged sword. The more features you add to such a game to make it more interesting, the less the player actually has to do to win, thus the more bored they get. Whereas the fewer features you have, the less there is to hold the player's attention, and thus the more bored they get. It's a lose-lose situation, so anyone who decides to make such a game nowadays goes into it knowing they're fighting an uphill battle with limited market appeal. But they do still get made, because despite the lack of interest from gamers in general, there are still people out there who absolutely love these games. So there is a market for them, it's just a very small market. But in any case, it was about time I took a look at where it all began, and this is a pretty accurate port of the arcade original. It's not perfect, but competent enough that only the most hardcore players are going to notice the inaccuracies between the two in terms of how the game plays. Arkanoid was originally released by Taito into arcades in 1986, but it got a massive number of ports to different consoles and computers. There's actually 3 DOS ports out there, technically. One was created by Firebird software, but it never saw the light of day because it was going to be published through Atari had they won their lawsuit. Another was created by Imagine Software, and while it did see a limited release, for some reason Taito licensed out NovaLogic to do a second DOS conversion, which subsequently ended up being the one most people are familiar with, is the one that with the most widespread distribution, and it also happens to be the one I have, and it's the one that came out in 1988. Now, even though the original arcade version of Arkanoid and several of the ports could handle 2 players taking turns, the NovaLogic DOS port only has a 1-player mode. Though it does support CGA 4-color, Tandy 16-color, and EGA 16-color graphics, and it also supports a Tandy 3-voice chipset for music if you run it with Tandy graphics, but you're otherwise stuck with the PC speaker. As for the game's current release state, this original DOS version remains commercial, and finding copies is next to impossible. Heck, even finding copies for any of the numerous other consoles and computers it came out for can be a trip and a half. So if you're looking for a copy for sake of collecting, you'd better buckle down and be prepared for a wait and probably a bidding war when one does show up. Unless you're looking for an NES or SNES card. The NES and SNES Arkanoid games, in general, are pretty common and tend to go for between $10 and $25 for loose carts. Plus, any modern version of the game is often pretty cheap, such as Arkanoid DS, which can often be found brand new for $10 due to its very low demand. However, all of that said, the formula hasn't changed much over the years, so if you're just wanting to play an Arkanoid game, not necessarily add a specific version to your collection, virtually any of them will suffice. My recommendations, if you want the gameplay as close to the original as possible without breaking your wallet in half, would be to get the SNES release, or Arkanoid 2 for DOS. The SNES version supports the SNES mouse, which is really handy, and it also has a number of extra features. The DOS sequel, Arkanoid 2, again has new features and doesn't cost an insane amount. Though it is also a bit more pricey, often going for about $30 to $40 complete in box. or just get a cheap modern version. There really are very few gameplay differences between all of them. There's technically a story to Arkanoid, but it's super simple. Sort of. Basically, at some point in time, it's not known when, a mothership known as Arkanoid ends up being destroyed by an unknown force. Now, the crew escapes in the vase, a specially designed craft able to deflect energy orbs for various purposes, and upon attempting to escape, they find themselves sucked into an unknown void filled with walls preventing them from going anywhere. Now, they try using the energy orbs to destroy the walls, and are met with success, but they need to keep the energy orb going as they only have the one. If they lose it, there's no hope for them. Now, the irony of this story is that it means the game is named after the ship which gets destroyed at the very beginning and has no further purpose to the story or gameplay following. So, it's kind of weird. In any case, the game is super simple to play, since it's ultimately a breakout clone. You have a paddle at the bottom, which is the vase, and you deflect a ball with it to destroy the bricks on screen. Destroy all the bricks to move on to the next level. Doesn't get any simpler than that. Although, as you might imagine, there is more to the game than simply bouncing the ball around. More to the point, whenever you destroy one of the colored bricks, there's a chance a power-up might drop from it. Adding power-ups is one of the core mechanics which help to set Arkanoid apart from Breakout, and we'll go over them in a bit, but I want to talk some more about some of the other things that this game added to the core formula, such as enemies. Every round, except for the very last one, has enemies coming out of the gates up top. Whenever you defeat an enemy, or it flies past the vase, a new one is spawned, up to a limit of 3 on screen at a time. Now, the enemies are tricky because hitting one with either the ball or the vase will destroy it, but when hit with the ball, there's a chance the ball's trajectory may change, and not always in a predictable way. And not every time either. Hitting the enemies with the ball adds some potential twitch reactions to the mix, especially if the ball is heading downward towards the vase at high speed, as it may just go right through, might bounce horizontally, or it may even bounce vertically and go back upwards. To keep the gameplay moving, and also keep the player on their toes, the speed of the ball also changes routinely, getting faster each time it does. Now, I know some people will claim that it's based on the passage of time, or the number of times the ball hits something solid, and, well, they're not entirely wrong. In fact, they're both right. From what I can tell, what's going on is that there's two separate things being tracked for altering the ball speed. A timer which goes at various intervals, but also the number of deflections, and that after a certain number of deflections, the ball will go faster. I've also noticed the speed up process happens more often on higher levels than on lower levels, although that could just be a factor of all the gold bricks. Oh yeah, there's actually two special kinds of bricks to worry about, metal and gold. The metal bricks take a variable number of hits to destroy, depending on what level you're on. The fewest hits it'll take is 2, but it can take several more than that on some levels. The gold bricks, on the other hand, are completely impervious to damage. I should also note that you cannot find power-ups in the metal bricks, ever. So you should probably factor this into your strategy in terms of which power-ups you go for. I should also point out the paddle physics. Arkanoid came out at a time when paddle physics weren't well defined, and at the same time, in combination with the power-ups present, the game needed to be designed in such a way that if someone left it going unattended on an arcade cabinet, it would eventually find a way to end the game in progress legitimately. So, to that end, the paddle works in such a way that it's impossible to hit the ball straight up. In fact, the ball will only move in one of 12 different directions. You can affect which direction by where the ball strikes the vase. The closer to the edge, the more of a horizontal direction the ball will take, whereas the closer to the middle, the more of a vertical direction. I should also note that if you hit the ball directly on the center, it'll count as a right side hit. And these physics are present in every Arkanoid game. Even the modern ones have it work this way. There's also a thing that can happen where the ball will suddenly change trajectory all on its own. Now, this happens when it hits a certain number of solid objects without hitting the vase. It's a pretty high number, but just be aware it can happen in some of the levels, because there are some where you need to weave the ball through large amounts of gold bricks, so it may end up just suddenly randomly changing direction just right out of the blue. Last thing to mention about the gameplay is that when you get to the final level, you fight the game's primary antagonist, known as Do, D-O-H. To win the battle, you just have to hit Do a certain number of times with the ball. But the trick is that he fires projectiles at your vase which will destroy it in a single hit. so you not only have to keep the ball in play, but dodge the projectiles as well. Defeat Do and you win the game, reversing time back to the point where the Arkanoid mothership was still intact. I'm giving power-ups their own section because there's actually a lot to say. But first, let's go over each of the 7 power-ups you can acquire, 5 of which are very common, the other 2 of which are a bit more interesting. The most basic power-up is the orange slow power-up. This causes the ball to drop 1 level in speed. Every round always starts at the 2nd speed level, so it's impossible to slow down the ball more than once if you do it right from the start. Plus, grabbing a slow power-up later on won't have a huge effect because of how much faster the ball's moving. Next is the blue enlarge power-up, which simply makes the vase a little longer so you can hit the ball more easily. Next we have the green catch power-up. This allows the vase to magnetize the ball every time it makes contact, allowing the ball to be held for a brief moment so the player can aim it wherever they want. The direction the ball flies off at will depend on where it made contact, just like you'd expect. I should also point out that the catch power-up doesn't last forever. Although it does last for a fairly long time, it'll eventually wear out if you manage to go for most of a round without grabbing anything else or losing a life. Next up is the red laser power-up. This is the one everybody wants, because it basically just lets the vase shoot the bricks down on its own accord. Now, although powerful, the one drawback is that you can't shoot through the gold bricks, so if gold bricks are present, you'll probably want to think twice about using this one. Next we have the cyan disruption power-up, which disrupts the ball and splits it into 3. Now, 2 important things to keep in mind when multiple balls are in play is that power-ups won't spawn, and that the balls don't deflect off of each other, only the enemies, bricks, and walls. Now, once 2 of the 3 balls drop out of play, power-ups can once again appear. The last 2 power-ups are actually kind of rare, and I'm convinced that there's a way to trigger them to appear, but I don't know what it is. The first is a purple break power-up, which breaks the edge of the playfield open so that the vase can escape and move on to the next level. And lastly is a gray player power-up, which adds an extra vase to your lives count at the bottom of the screen, which, even though it visually tops out at 5 lives, it will actually count higher than that. Now, the reason I believe there's a way to trigger these power-ups is because during my initial practice runs before I started recording, I actually found quite a few of both of these. When I actually started recording footage, out of 4 hours of play, I found 1 extra life and not a single break power-up. None! But what's more interesting than that is that when I did get that 1 extra life, the last 3 digits in my score were all zeros. I did some investigating and found that all of the other power-ups are pretty much random. If there is some methodology deciding on which of them show up, I couldn't figure it out, as it definitely wasn't just a score counter. Not to mention, if a particular power-up is active, it doesn't show up. For instance, if you have a laser power-up, no other laser power-ups are going to drop. Now, in terms of the break power-up, my only working theory, given that it always shows up near the start of a level, is that it might be tied in with hitting a very specific power-up holding brick as fast as possible. The trick with that being that no other power-up can be on the field. Now, either way, the break and player power-ups are supposed to be more common than I was finding them while recording, but they are still the rarest of the 7 that you can find. There's a couple other important points about the power-ups too. Firstly, whenever you pick up a power-up, no matter what kind it is, the state of your vase will always reset first. This means if you have an extended paddle or a laser and you suddenly see a catch power-up dropping, you have to decide which you'd rather have. Or if you see an extra life dropping, you have to consider if having that extra life will be worth losing the effect that you currently have on the vase. I've read that some ports of the original Arkanoid may allow stacking effects, but my experience with the DOS version at least shows that it can't happen here. And last thing to mention is that not every colored brick can drop power-up. The rounds are actually defined in such a way that only specific bricks can drop power-ups, if they do at all, as there's still a chance that a brick which can drop a power-up won't. And this is just something to keep in mind as you plan your strategies. I mean, really, what is there to say overall about the original Arkanoid? It helped reinvigorate the breakout genre, which was dying a slow death during the mid-80s due to a lack of innovation. This DOS port isn't arcade perfect, but it is pretty close. And about the only ways they could have made it better would be to make the paddle collisions a bit more accurate, and have some sort of paddle controller you could attach to the PC to get that perfect analog control. It's only possible with such a thing. Since when you look at these old arcade cabinets for these kinds of games, you find a knob on them, which you turn to move the paddle side to side, not a joystick. Since there's better versions of Arkanoid out there than this one, not to mention this one's so hard to find, I'd primarily recommend this original DOS version for collectors, not people just looking for more Breakout style of games to play. Not to mention, Breakout is such a simple concept, you can make your own such game in virtually any game engine very quickly with minimal effort. I'm presuming you don't add tons of other features. For running the game in DOSBox, just leave cycle set to auto, set the machine type to Tandy to get the Tandy 3 voice music, and you're pretty much good to go. Yeah, nothing more to the configuration this time around. Anywho, that's all for episode 220 of Ancient DOS Games. Next Saturday is a filler, and you guys are definitely going to want to watch it. I'm going to be covering a topic in great detail, which I don't think a lot of people know about, as it has to do with how Windows has worked for countless years now, yet is something which can not only screw up what should be perfectly smooth frame rates on perfectly capable systems, but it can also slow down games which aren't coded to take this into consideration, both indie and AAA titles. And yes, I'll be showing examples too, so be sure to stay tuned because this filler is going to be an interesting one. Thanks for watching everyone, and special thanks to those of you supporting me on Patreon. Here's just a small sample of you guys.